Very warm welcome from the sociology discipline at Melbourne. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation and hope I find out more about that kind of from risk to resilience idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very generous words in introduction, and thanks to the Sociology group here at Melbourne and the Risk and Society group for bringing me here, and in particular to Charlotte and Anna for being so persuasive that I came to visit Melbourne again. The downside of this is it's been a bit of a long trip for me, and my voice is not really holding up very well. So if I keep drinking water and go a bit croaky, you'll know why. The odd thing is, in the light of this introduction, that actually I'm not working on governmentality anymore. For the last 10 years I've been working on the life sciences, of course inspired by some of these approaches, but really trying to focus on a different realm of problems. And in fact I came across the question of resilience partly in relation to that work on the life sciences with my colleague at King's College, Philippa Lensos. We were doing some work on biosecurity, and in particular on the biosecurity risks that might be raised by prospects of bioterrorism. We were both working in the area of synthetic biology and biological weapons. And reading through the strategies for dealing with biosecurity, I became struck by the fact that, at least in the UK, the term resilience was absolutely central. Indeed, the whole website for dealing with biosecurity in the UK government was called UK Resilience. And resilience seemed to me to be something different from preparedness or protection. And that's really where this little quest to understand what was going on with resilience began. And this is still, I have to emphasize, a work in progress. So let me kick off. So when was it that we, the inhabitants of advanced liberal democracies, began to think of ourselves as living in an era of risk? Perhaps we could date it to Ulrich Beck's Risk Society, first published in 1991, whose view was, to put it crudely, a realist one. Progress in such societies, in particular scientific progress, had itself generated a precarious and risky form of life for us, even if we did not fully appreciate it. For others, though, risk was less an existential feature of our present than a mode of apprehension of that present, a way of thinking and acting, and a host of influential books were published on these themes at around that time, most notably Ian Hacking's Taming of Chance, published in 1990, which memorably described risk thinking as an attitude which aims to bring the future into the present and to make it calculable and hence actionable, to act in the present to forestall the undesirable events that one can predict in the future. For Hacking's work, risk was not a property of reality, but a style of thought, something which would already have been self-evident for those who'd read Mary Douglas on this theme. And it was this notion of risk as a style of thought, as a way of problematizing experience, or perhaps better, a way of turning something problematic into something thinkable, governable. That approach underpinned a different genre of inquiry. For this mode of investigation, the important questions concern the ways in which authorities concerned with managing, regulating, controlling, or to put it most generally, governing a whole range of problems, persons, institutions, and locales, had come to conceptualize their work in terms of risk, who were obliged to think of their labors in terms of the assessment and management of risk. My own work on these themes in the 1990s, that's a quarter of a century ago, Gosh, can I still remember it? But it was inspired by reading a prescient paper by Robert Castel called Dangerousness to Risk, and my own work focused on psychiatry. Now, psychiatry had been a political science since its inception in the 19th century. Think, for instance, of its role in the definition and control of degeneracy, or the management of maladjusted children, maladjusted soldiers, maladjusted workers. But it was now part of a much larger apparatus for the expert assessment and management of problematic persons in terms of risk. This wasn't just a matter of the focus of forensic psychiatry on dangerousness, the identification and management of those dangerous individuals of whom Michel Foucault wrote. As I put it then, while dangerousness was a property of the concrete individual, risk is a combination of factors which are not necessarily dangerous in themselves: age of mother, type of family background, job record, type of housing. And this way of risk had emerged as a way of making intelligible and manageable a whole series of problems of contemporary existence. The language of risk, I suggested, was indicative of a shift towards a logic in which the possibility of incurring misfortune or loss in the future was not to be left to fate, not to be managed by a providential state. On the one hand, risk management was to be part of the obligations of each individual. On the other, all manner of future dangers were to be reconceptualized in the language of risk. These new forms of management through risk involved a new conception of the subjects to be governed, new, that is, in relation to the logics of social insurance that were mutating. Rather than risks being managed on behalf of citizens by a social state through social insurance and the like, individuals were held responsible for the management of their own fate and their own families and required to make predictions about the future consequences of present actions, bringing the future into the present and making it calculable. When it came to unemployment, old age, ill health, or security, prudent individuals, and here I was working with Pat O'Malley, whose own work on prudentialism is well known, prudent individuals would seek assistance from expertise in order to identify the best ways to know and manage future risk. Risk management was to become a technique of the prudent self. And in this process, a new array of dividing practices came into existence, dividing those who did manage their own risk from those who did not, and dividing those who did not into those who could not, who would not, or who are simply unable to do so. Now, in the case of psychiatry, to quote Castel again, the site of diagnostic synthesis was no longer the concrete relation of the sick person, but a relationship constituted among the different expert assessments which made up a patient's dossier. Every subject of psychiatry, confined or not, was to be assessed in terms of the risk they potentially presented to themselves or others, and decisions as to what was to be done with them depended on that assessment. And what was at stake here was the management of individuals on the territory of everyday life. Failures of management of the self, lack of skills of coping with work, with money, with housing, failures to be compliant with medication were now all risk factors that fed into a decision as to what was to be done. And in this process, the organization of expertise changed. While the psychiatrist was still nominally in charge of the case, the judgments of the psychiatrist were no longer so much clinical as what one might term quotidian in terms of the everyday management of the psychiatric self. And the multidisciplinary team, which was so beloved by many programmers, came less out of the recognition of the therapeutic role of different kinds of expertise, but their contribution to the answer to the question, what is to be done? Of course, the role of risk in the government of potentially pathological persons wasn't new in the 1990s. In the UK, one can trace it back to the idea of risk registers of parents whose children were thought to suffer a non-accidental injury. As it happens, my very first piece of paid employment was working for the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children when we were setting up these risk registers back sometime in the depths of last century. But what one begins to see over this period is a generalization of this logic to a whole array of professionals, not just psychiatrists and social workers, but also many others involved in risk assessment and risk management, in particular the police, so well described by the sadly missed Richard Erickson, who were increasingly involved in risk assessment and risk management, increasingly becoming advisors to others on the nature of risk and so on. And as developed by Jonathan Simon and Malcolm Feely, these ways of thinking were linked to a shift in the logic of crime control, away from the apprehension and punishment of criminals towards the management of the criminogenic situation, identified on actuarial grounds, and the reduction of the probabilities of crime in such situations. In other words, less governing crime as governing a whole array of contexts and persons through crime. Now, despite this mutation, there was no diminution in the concern to identify and manage the risky individual. The risky individual wasn't the dangerous individual, with pathology inscribed as a kind of fixed quantum in the interior. Risk was probability, it was dimensional, it was situational, it wasn't a once and for all diagnosis, but required continuous monitoring and evaluation. A whole extended task for professionals and their dossiers and their modes of communication and consultation, which, as we know, are continually failing. And in the case of psychiatry, and now in the case of the paedophile, this dimensional and situational notion of risk draws upon another, which sees those risky people as fundamentally distinct, even monstrous. In the UK, you see a convergence of these ways of thinking and these practices of risk management in the so-called multi-agency public protection arrangements, the MAPPers, which since 2000 have had the responsibility for the management of registered sex offenders, violent and other types of sexual offenders, and offenders who pose a serious risk of harm to the public. Risk thinking also infused many other practices, notably that of medicine, where medical practitioners became all-purpose experts in the assessment and management, not so much of illness itself, but of the possibilities and probabilities of future malfunction of body and soul, or a relapse of an illness previously treated. Of course, in medical thought and practice, there are many varieties of risk thinking, clinical, actuarial, epidemiological, and so forth. But overarching them all was the belief in risk prediction and risk management, and the belief that by this means, not only would the incidence of future illnesses be reduced, but so would the, quote, burden of ill health, the ever-rising costs of illness and its treatment to the national exchequer. As we know, this belief led to great market opportunities for the pharmaceutical companies whose best-selling products, such as the statins and the medicines for lowering blood pressure, operate to treat not illness, but risks. And in colonizing this almost infinite empire of risk, they've generated their own ills of adverse events and so forth. And this concern with risk in the current work that I'm doing has also fueled the search for biomarkers, a highly profitable sector of the medical biotech industry, with the belief that if one can identify the markers of potential illness before they become apparent, genetic markers or neurobiological markers, then one might be able to screen for them, not only in the office of the general practitioner, but also in the population itself, and intervene early. Earlier, as it said, being almost always better. Barely a day goes by without some report of the discovery of a biomarker for cancer, heart disease, psychiatric illness, or Alzheimer's. Yet the logic of screen and intervene, tied to these styles of thought about risk prediction, is more problematic than it seems at first. One only needs to consider the number necessary to screen to prevent one untoward incident, the number of false positives and false negatives, the implications of ascribing a risk identity to individuals on the basis of uncertain and probabilistic information, especially in cases such as psychopathy or dementia, to take some examples where I've been working. Enough. I don't want to suggest that this kind of risk thinking has become redundant, or that these practices of governing through risk are on the wane. I doubt that this is the case. Indeed, in the area that I've recently studied, psychiatry and neuroscience, the search for risk factors and biomarkers and that logic of screen and intervene marches on remorselessly. But I do want to suggest to you that the image of a society where almost all undesirable events can be reframed in the language of risk and managed in terms of risks that are potentially calculable, predictable, and manageable by expertise, that image is beginning to be called into question, along with the type of expert practice and the forms of subjectivity that risk entails. And the one term that embodies this mutation most clearly is resilience. So let me turn to resilience. The theme of resilience reworks the problem of risk in the face of a particular perception of our present. That we live in uncertain times, things are changing fast, the dynamics of our interconnected world escape our linear models of calculation and intervention, that we're vulnerable not only to known threats that are difficult to predict, such as jihadist terrorism and climate change, but also to those famous unknown unknowns, which we cannot even specify, but for which we must be prepared. I don't think this is just a new way of speaking about risk or the risk society. Strategies of risk management imagine the future as somehow similar to the present. They believe, as I've said several times already, that it's possible to bring the future into the present and make it calculable. But the theme of resilience responds to a perception that our futures are not predictable or calculable in this way. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary gives us a number of definitions of resilience dating back to 1626. To put it at its most simple, resilience is the capacity to cope with adversity or to bounce back after a blow. In the industrializing societies of the mid-19th century, the term was applied to the mechanical properties of some materials. But it always had metaphorical senses. Individuals, families, communities could be resilient as much as bridges and buildings. In a present that our authorities find difficult to decipher, and a future where unknowable, unpredictable, and catastrophic events seem inescapable, the language of resilience has found a multitude of niches in which to flourish. It's become prominent in strategies ranging from biosecurity to community empowerment, training in the US military, the raising of children to meet the demands of the future. This language of resilience is eminently translatable. It connects up different places and different occurrences, links the macro and the micro, associates the institutional and the subjective, for instance, making connections between the preparedness of a city's energy supply to cope with flooding and the capacities of its citizens to manage such a disaster. As a personal capacity, resilience is both exceptional. Some remarkable people have come through terrible ordeals only to bounce back stronger. And it's ordinary. All living systems and living individuals have the capacity to adapt to the challenge of turbulent environments. It's both natural. Human beings are by nature resilient. And it can be taught by consultants for governments and organizations, by psychologists and social workers for their clients, by parents for their children, by trainers for military personnel. We can be resilient as individuals to small reversals of fortune that impact our own life, and we can be resilient as communities, as nations, as populations to the major geopolitical and environmental challenges that will confront us. Hence, resilience seems perfectly suited to our problematic present. Of course, as I've said, the language of risk remains pervasive, but risk thinking is permeated with a kind of anxiety towards the future. Resilience, even though it posits a future that escapes rational management by experts, is nonetheless saturated with a certain kind of optimism. If we're resilient, whatever is thrown at us, we can survive and thrive. Now, resilience strategies have been extensively criticised by social and political theorists on the grounds that they are, quote, neoliberal. Critics suggest that resilience, whether it concerns children, citizens, or communities, is yet another twist in the logics of responsibilization, in which the state and public authorities relinquish their obligations for the provision of security and well-being and turn a willfully blind eye to structural inequalities and disadvantage, devolving to individuals and communities the responsibility to manage their own insecurities, or even abandoning them to their fate. Now, it's true that in one sense, the ethic of resilience is linked to the belief, maybe the recognition, that of the limits of the capacity of the state and the political apparatus. On the one hand, political authorities cannot, on their own, take the responsibility to redress social wrongs, let alone provide the wherewithal for a fulfilled life. On the other, the state cannot secure its citizens against all possible threats, whether they be of pandemics, floods, or terrorism. But these themes aren't exclusive to neoliberalism. Most contemporary political programs take the view that an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-protective state is neither economically feasible nor politically desirable. So resilience has no single logic. And before we rush to condemn it, perhaps, just perhaps, we might see whether there are any progressive possibilities in the emergence of this term and the strategies to which it is giving rise. The logic of resilience in contemporary governmental strategies is something like this. Absolute security is impossible. We will experience adversity, although we cannot accurately predict when, how, or in what form. Preparedness, planning, precaution, preemption, preclusion, prediction, all those P's with which we are so familiar, these are all necessary endeavors, but they can never be completely successful. The anticipation work of experts and authorities, as we're too painfully aware, all too often fails to predict many of the dangerous events that actually occur. Plans which seem rigorous on paper often miscarry in practice. Painstakingly organized systems of communication break down in the face of disasters and crises. Hence, these anticipatory activities are insufficient. So when we experience adversity, when dreadful events happen, how shall we respond as individuals, as communities, as nations? Shall our defenses crumble? Shall our systems collapse? Shall our populations panic? Shall each of us be paralyzed with dread or disabled by trauma? Shall our children, faced with misfortune, suffering in their early lives, be condemned to failure or criminality? Or can we resist the damaging blows, bounce back from disaster, recover from our misfortunes, adapt to our new situations, perhaps even emerge stronger, fitter, more resourceful? In other words, be resilient. And if we can identify what makes some resilient, some buildings, some systems, some economies, some communities, some individuals, can we not teach resilience, learn resilience, enhance resilience? Can't we have experts of resilience able to advise us how to become resilient? If no authority can deliver total security, if total security is a costly fantasy, then perhaps, so the argument goes, resilience is a more economical alternative, indeed perhaps a more liberal alternative, drawing as it does not on an image of an overwhelming and powerful authority that will protect us, but on the resources of each and all of us as vital creatures, that is to say, creatures with the will to survive and the capacity to adapt to our milieu. Now, this isn't the place for a genealogy of resilience, but we can learn a little just from a glance at the history of this term in social and political science. Some suggest that the term resilience first appears in its modern form in ecology, with the publication of Holling's Resilience and Stability of Ecological Systems in 1973, which became the basis of the work of the Resilience Alliance, founded in 1999. Resilience for Hollings took two forms. It was either to characterize a return to a previous state or a move to a new stable state which retained some of the functions and capacities of the state that had been lost. Others find a key early use in Wildavsky's distinction between anticipation, where some central intelligence seeks to predict and prevent dangers before they emerge, and resilience as having the capacity to cope with dangers that had not been anticipated. Still others see the first use in studies of children who had suffered great adversity and yet went on to lead successful lives. For example, Werner's work on a longitudinal study of the children of the Hawaiian island of Kauai, which commenced in 1955. In the 1970s, a few papers appear which speak of the resilience of religions or nations. In the 1980s, there's increasing discussion of the resilience of economies, and there are papers on the resilience of individuals. In particular, an emphasis on the resilience of children in the face of adversity, perhaps culminating in Michael Rutter's highly cited paper of 1987 on psychosocial resilience and protective mechanisms. We're going to return to these resilient children a little bit later on. Now, from this point on, the term burgeons. It begins to apply to resilient families, survivors of abuse and maltreatment, women who've been sexually assaulted, prisoners of wars, and so on, along with references to the resilience of soil, states in crisis, and so on. But children remain the main focus of social science literature on resilience, with growing interest in the characteristics of children who survive and flourish against the odds, especially black children in the urban ghettos of the United States, and with the development of interventions that might foster or increase resilience. As I say, I'll get back to these resilient children a little bit later on, but resilience was for adults too. Consider the rise of the problematics of resilience in the US military. Now, many of you may have read Alan Young's classical study of post-traumatic stress disorder in the US military that was published in 1995. The word resilience does not appear in that text, yet in the years that followed in the United States, resilience became central to understanding and managing the fitness of military personnel and their liability to break down on returning from combat. In the first decade of the 21st century, the US military began a program of research on the factors affecting resilience to stress. This identified factors ranging from neurobiological to hormonal, but placed great emphasis on the potential protective role of psychosocial factors such as, quotes, optimism, humor, cognitive flexibility, cognitive explanatory style, acceptance, religion, spirituality, altruism, social support, role models, coping style, exercise, capacity to recover from negative events, and stress inoculation, close quote. Military training and military selection began to focus on these psychosocial factors, and these became central to the so-called Comprehensive Soldier and Family Fitness Program that was launched in 2002. Although there was little, if any, evidence of efficacy, by 2013, the US Army had put into place its comprehensive, quote, Ready and Resilient program, based on the belief that, quote, individual resilience can be built, maintained, and strengthened and acquired through regular training. There were resilience inventories, there were resilience strategies, programs for enhancing resilience prior to combat, rebuilding resilience in those who returned traumatized. And most controversy focused on programs that sought to enhance resilience through, quotes, spiritual fitness, strengthening a set of beliefs, principles, or values that sustain a person beyond family, institutional, and societal sources of strength. Spiritual fitness was to be enhanced by activities that looked remarkably like prayer meetings and was heavily criticized for a kind of inculcation of religion in the American Army. Over the first decade of this century, resilience also became central in discussions about disaster management, Hurricane Katrina, the 9/11 attacks on the US, and the 7/7 bombings in London. There was much concern with infrastructure resilience, but the subjective capacities to deal with disaster were also central. As Chandler puts it, in the context of discussing human security in development, in this new way of thinking, the subjects of development are not viewed as passive victims, but active agents who participate in their own development, while vulnerable subjects are those that lack the capacity for resilience. I quote, "Intervention is increasingly rationalized as facilitating, empowering, or capacity building the vulnerable subject on the ground," close quote. Resilience, that is to say, is an antidote to a condition which is now increasingly termed vulnerability. We have, it seems, become vulnerable in so many ways. Vulnerable ecosystems, vulnerable infrastructure, vulnerable food supplies, vulnerability to climate change, vulnerability to economic shocks and turbulence, vulnerability to terrorism, or just vulnerability to the challenges of the rapidly changing world in which our children have to live. And if vulnerability is the problem, resilience is the best approach. America the Vulnerable was the title of a book published in 2004 by Stephen Flynn, president of the US Center for Natural Policy, and this book was reflecting on US security policy post 9/11. 3 years later, resilience became his central theme. I'll give you a little quote. "The United States needs the kind of resilience that the British displayed during World War II when V-1 bombers were raining down on London. More than half a century later, the United Kingdom showed its resilience once more after suicide bombers attacked the London Underground. That objective was foiled when resolute commuters showed up to board the trains the next morning. And this is the important part, whereas increasing security measures is an inevitable answer to a society's fears, resilience rests on a foundation of confidence and optimism. It allows Americans to remain true to their ideals, no matter what tempest the future may bring." End of quote. So resilience is natural if only we can recover it when it's been lost, if we can only understand what it is, and if we can only optimize it, we can overcome anxiety and face that uncertain and unpredictable future with optimism. This message is a very powerful one, and its power lies in part in the very ambiguity of the term, its capacity to, quote, translate between the ethical, the subjective, the organizational, the institutional, and the political, to move from place to place, program to program, problem space to problem space, and to move from being a program to being a technology, and from being a technology to being an ethics by which individuals manage their everyday life. And like all successful political strategies, it embodies a particular conception of its subjects and is able to turn that conception technical, generating a human technology, a way of managing individuals so as to govern their conduct. Now, critics suggest that resilient thinking and resilient strategies are fundamentally neoliberal in that they displace responsibilities from the state to others, and in particular to individuals who acquire a new obligation to become resilient, to optimize themselves in conditions of adversity. Some suggest that it more or less abandons subjects to their fate, embodying a view that resilient subjects should not hanker after the misleading illusion of a security provided by others, but must adapt to dangers, thrive on adversity, become resilient, and thrive under pressure. But if we look a little more closely at research on resilience, we see that it seldom, if ever, frames it as a capacity to be instilled into the autonomous and individuated subject, coping with adversity on his or her own. From the early work on children, resilience to adversity has been seen not merely as an individual capacity, but dependent on a whole range of trans-individual protective factors. In the classic study of the children of the cow eye, which I've already mentioned, whose title, by the way, was Vulnerable but Invincible, Werner and Smith argued that the resilience that was developed by these vulnerable children was grounded in close relations with others within the family and outside it, including emotional support. And these vulnerable but invincible children engaged in close relations with others, in socially responsible activities and so forth. Not only were these social factors protective, but they also characterized the form of life of those who became resilient. And in his much-cited work in the 1980s, Michael Rutter pointed to the need for, quotes, compensating experiences outside the home, the development of self-esteem, the scope and range of available opportunities, an appropriate degree of structure, personal bonds, intimate relations, and so on. Similar themes are stressed in almost all subsequent work on resilience. Subjective resilience grows out of protective solidarity and generates such sociality in its turn. Thus, all the contributors to Michael Unger's Handbook of Theory and Practice, called The Social Ecology of Resilience, stress, to quote his introduction, quote, the resilience of individuals growing up in challenging contexts or facing significant personal adversity is dependent on the quality of the social and physical ecologies that surround them, as much as, and likely far more than, their personality traits, cognitions, or talents. Social ecological factors such as family, school, neighborhood, community service, and cultural practices are as influential as psychological aspects of positive development when individuals are under stress. Now, perhaps this emphasis isn't surprising, given that this volume focuses on the question of, as I've said, the social ecology of resilience. But consider this study of survivor reactions to the 2005 London bombings. The survivors, this study argues, were, quote, characterized by adaptive features such as order, solidarity, and mutual aid, rather than the dysfunctional individualism and panic that characterized psychosocial vulnerability. Importantly, it was the crowd itself that was the basis of the resilience displayed by survivors. A sense of psychological unity with others during emergencies is the basis of being able to give and accept support, to act together with a shared understanding of what is practically and morally necessary, to see others' plight as linked to our own rather than counterposed. End of quote. So far from individualism returning in the face of disaster, these researchers claim to find just the reverse: collective self-help, cooperation, the development of informal networks, what they term collective resilience. Hence the view that resilience both emerges naturally in individuals and groups, but is something that can be enhanced. We need to move, says Bonnie Bernard of the Resiliency Associates, from a deficit perspective that focuses on youth and families at risk to one that recognizes what resilience research has shown, that most youth make it, that all individuals have the power to transform and change, and that even for, quotes, children born in extremely high-risk environments, such as poverty-stricken or war-torn communities, as well as families with alcoholism, drug abuse, physical and sexual abuse, and mental illness, researchers worldwide have documented the amazing finding that at least 50%, and usually closer to 70% of these high-risk children grow up not only to be successful by societal indicators, but confident, competent, and caring, end of quote. And Bernard's own study of fostering resilience in kids argues that what began as a quest to understand the extraordinary has revealed the power of the ordinary. Resilience doesn't come from rare and special qualities, but from the everyday magic of ordinary normative human resources in the minds, brains, and bodies of children, their families, relationships, and communities. So resilience is natural, but it can be enhanced by education and training, by parents and teachers who know how to foster it, who know how to model the caring, positive expectations and inviting that engage the innate resilience in our students. Now, these resilience strategies are, it's true, post-social strategies for governing. The imagined territory on which they act is not that of society but community. The individual is imagined as a moral subject, enmeshed in bonds of affinity with others, in localized ties to a specific moral collectivity. And community here is a means of government for the soldier in the US military as much as for the child in adversity. Resilient subjectivity is to be shaped and supported by strategies to strengthen bonds of community, allegiance, and affinity. Now, I gave a very first version of this paper in Colombia and came across this case study of urban resilience in situations of chronic violence by José Semper. Now, Semper argues that in the insecure communities of Medellin in Colombia, plagued by violence, where the state is largely absent, a range of strategies to enhance community resilience can enable communities to wrest control back from armed actors in their territory. Community resilience isn't here placed in opposition to the state. Resilience, Semper says, appears at the interface of citizen and state action and is strengthened through cooperation within and between communities and governing authorities. When citizens, the private sector, and governing authorities establish institutional networks of accountability that tie them to each other at the level of the community, a dynamic capacity is created to subvert the perpetrators of violence and establish everyday normalcy. Close quotes. So on the one hand, securing individuals against adversity, whether from poverty, urban violence, or even catastrophic external events, is beyond the power of the state alone. On the other, innovative action, whether by loving parents, inspiring teachers, resourceful communities, can not merely enable survival, but flourishing in novel and more effective, perhaps even more democratic ways by maximizing resilience. All right, well, let me move towards some kind of a conclusion here. And this little section is called Beyond Critique. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has become an all-purpose term of critique in much critical social science. It's often a means of avoiding the complexity of careful analysis and evaluation. What is happening? Neoliberalism. Why is it happening? Neoliberalism. What's wrong with it? Neoliberalism. As is obvious, I'm not a fan of such totalizing analyses. Is neoliberalism an ideology, a doctrine, a political project, a strategy, an epoch? When the term is used, does it refer to actually existing neoliberalism, which takes complex and hybrid forms in different contexts, or is it an interpretive notion? Even when the proponents deny it, behind their protestation really lies neoliberalism. Or is it merely a term of critique applied to policies that do not believe that structural reforms undertaken by government can on their own overcome poverty and disadvantage, leaving those solely to market competition and the search for private profit, urging each individual to become an entrepreneur of themselves or consign themselves to a twilight world of exclusion? If that was the definition of neoliberalism, then very few contemporary political strategies would match it. Indeed, in relation to resilience, it's a pejorative rather than analytical use of the term that's dominant. Critics argue that the contemporary deployment of the language of resilience ignores structural deficiencies, poverty, inequality, and racism, focusing only on the resilient individual. They accuse those who promote these strategies of a willful denial of the collective, intersubjective, and infrastructural conditions for resilience. They argue that the language of resilience serves to justify a shifting of responsibility from the state to individuals and communities themselves, making the least advantaged responsible for managing their own condition, masking the failure of social policies to reduce economic, educational, and social inequity, and serving the needs of a neoliberal market economy wedded to the idea of competition and global economic competitiveness, seeking to maximize shareholder value, presided over by a minimalist state. And they argue that in distorting arguments about resilience, these interventions actually downplay the natural resilience of individuals and communities in order to justify normative interventions to build such resilience. Now, these damning verdicts, which find the interests of the state and neoliberalism everywhere, leave little space for ambiguity or for optimism, even if one might sneakily feel that national productivity and global competitiveness were not such bad things to hope for, or that a frank admission of the limitations of political action might be no bad thing, or that nostalgia for the welfare state conveniently forgets the many vigorous criticisms that progressives mounted against such policies in their heyday. Framed in this way, there seems little virtuous or promising in the current reconceptualization of the responsibilities of citizens in terms of resilience, merely a monotonous narrative of authorities denying their responsibilities while imposing those responsibilities on the very individuals they are paid to serve. Of course, resilience, like empowerment, recovery, mindfulness, can rapidly switch from radical alternatives to tools in the toolkit of professionals to be used coercively and normatively in order to judge. You will become resilient. It is your responsibility if you fail. But I suggest that with resilience, we might do better to abstain from a rush to judgment, to refrain from seeking a grand overarching logic such as neoliberalism, and to explore the polyvalence of resilience strategies and ask whether, how, and in what ways we might find some handholds for a more optimistic intellectual and political engagement. As someone almost once said, no doubt everything is dangerous or carries the possibility of danger, but that doesn't mean that everything is bad, let alone everything should be denounced in favor of a better yesterday, which has already failed, or a better tomorrow that is seldom specified. All right, a few words in conclusion then. I've argued elsewhere that we shouldn't assume that all is for the worst in this post-social age, but we should try and identify the points of weakness that might be exploited if we're to maximize the capacity of individuals and collectivities to shape the knowledges, contest the authorities, and configure the practices that will govern them in the name of their freedoms and commitments. And perhaps strategies and technologies of resistance do provide some options here. We inhabit a time when the future doesn't seem just risky, but constitutively unpredictable, suffused with unknown unknowns, interconnected in ways that confound linear models of cause and effect, where events respect no barriers of geography or culture in their implications. In such a context, where fears of ungovernability might be overwhelming, the logic of resilience is a hopeful one. We may be vulnerable, but we can develop the capacities to bounce back from disaster, to recover from calamities, to adapt to these dangers, and in this process, we may even become stronger. To foster resilience is not to create disciplined subjects whose conduct is fixed by norms and judged in terms of good and bad. It doesn't require some all-seeing government agency that seeks to know and regulate everything in a territory, but nor does it seek to devolve all responsibilities to isolated, autonomous, individualized subjects, seeking to live their life as entrepreneurial self, maximizing their utilities and responding to market incentives. In its imagination, strategies of resilience seek to make use of the natural capacities of living human beings to come to terms with adversity when they're part of supportive networks of community affiliation. They don't entail the fantasy of the anti-liberal and vastly expensive dystopia of total protection, prevention, precaution, and preclusion based on the belief that threats and dangers can be identified and planned for in advance. Resilience strategies seem highly light, mobile, and translatable ways of dealing with contingency. Of course, there's work to be done in analyzing the nature of these resilience strategies. seeing the problems around which they form, examining the explanations in detail, seeing the techniques of government to which they are given rise, analysing the new authorities of resilience that are taking shape, and in particular examining the new subjectivities that are supposed. What is the new form of personhood of the resilient subject? What are the new technologies of the resilient self? And there is much to criticise in the new obligations of parents, teachers, community workers, and ourselves to make ourselves resilient. Resilience without power is disingenuous. Resilience without the resources and the capacity to become resilient is indeed something to be highly criticised. And it's also true that resilience seems in some way or other conservative, to bounce back, to restore a previous state, not to become stronger, not to become different. So there are these at least two meanings in resilience that go right back to the early work of Hollings. And we should probably resist the idea that the aim of resilience strategy is to maintain the status quo as it was. But nonetheless, I think there are some positive ways forward that are indicated, or at least possible to be affirmed within resilience. It's not a question, as others have argued, of being governed or not governed, but it's a question of how we are governed, of governing ourselves and others differently. And I believe resilience can offer individuals and collectivities a greater space of action. It does open new possibilities for legitimate contestation in the name of resilience. It does authorize arguments concerning the distributed resources and capacities and solidarities that are necessary to produce resilient subjects. And it can recognize and enhance, contingency and enhance creativity. So perhaps, just perhaps, there's something here worth affirming, to fight not against resilience, not to proclaim our nobility of resistance or to indulge in critique, but to see what there is on the territory of resilience that we might work for. Who should be resilient? For what? Who should be held accountable? What power is required to make resilience a reality? What are the collective conditions for resilience? And I think, possibly, if we began to analyse in those ways, we might find something helpful for our progressive politics in the new language of resilience. Thank you very much for your attention.
So now's the opportunity to ask Professor Rose some questions. Anything can help me do that. You can facilitate the questions within the auditorium. So you can interpret and say Professor Rose. Like I said, those of you who are watching this streaming, they can use the hashtag #RiskRose to pose their questions, and I'll sit down and monitor that now and see how many questions
I have to say, Anna, this is the first time I've been turned into a hashtag, but...
And do you like the hashtag?
#RiskRose, I can probably live with that, yeah.
Are we going to risk it? Come and listen. Okay. I'm going to take a minute so you can go ahead. So the questions in the auditorium, let's start with those.
Hi there, Professor Rose. I just have a point of clarification. I was just wondering if you could clarify what you mean by a post-social age. Excuse my ignorance.
Okay, so that could be a long answer or a short answer. I'll try and make it short. So by referring to a social age, I refer to the forms of government, rationalities and technologies of government that began to take shape, certainly in the global north, in the late 19th and early 20th century, that saw that the security of society and of its institutions could only be sustained by forms of sociality, by social right, by social citizenship, by social insurance, and so on, that sought to bind individuals into a domain of the social where collective risks, where risks were collectivized and managed in that way, where everything, in a sense, had to be managed through the creation and an intensification of those bonds of social solidarity that linked individuals together. And by a post-social age, I mean the kinds of the consequences of the kinds of attacks that we saw on those forms of welfare sociality across many countries in Europe, in North America, and indeed in Australia and New Zealand from around the 1980s for the next 20 years or so. That's what I mean by a post-social age, when the socializing social insurance no longer seems so obvious as the solution to all our ills.
I'm interested, the issue of resilience is an interesting one because all those studies that you spoke about were about the resilience of children and adults from conditions of poverty and disaster and negative social situations. And I'm wondering whether the technologies of resilience now are trying to work out what happens in societies such as ours, where those particular disastrous conditions don't exist, and whether there are questions about the sort of social world in which we live, where we make life so easy, and there you get the right wing talking about how there is this culture of entitlement and whinging, and is this undermining notions of how to produce resilience in people?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I certainly think that you see a rerun of the 1980s and 90s critique of the welfare state as increasing dependency, as reducing self-reliance, as inducing a culture in which others are responsible for one's own destiny. Those themes are still familiar to us today, and quite often those themes are simply reworked in the language of resilience. So what's happening here is that people's natural resilience is being whittled away and replaced by dependency and so on. So I'm certainly not saying that every time you hear the word resilience, every time a politician speaks of resilience as an answer, you should applaud those strategies. What I'm, I think, trying to suggest is that within the emergence of this wide-ranging use of the notion of resilience, everything from resilience against terrorist attacks to resilience against adversity and poverty, etc., within the increasing transformation of a world of risk into a world of resilience, there are some positive handholds that we might work upon, especially if we recognize that resilience can be articulated as something which grows out of particular forms of social relations, modes of solidarity, types of resources, intersubjective resources, that resilience is not an individual psychological capacity. So I think there's something within the argument itself that we can use, that one can use. There's, I know people always think of me as a kind of Foucauldian. So Michel Foucault's notion of resistance always suggests that resistance to something successful resistance doesn't come from outside. It involves grabbing a handhold on the way in which powers try to regulate you and turning that back against those powers themselves. That is the most effective strategy for transformation. And that's what, in a rather inchoate way, I'm trying to suggest lies in some way or other in this new language of resilience.
Thank you for your presentation today, Professor Rose. You just mentioned then that you're thought of as a Foucauldian. In sort of an oversimplistic way, Foucault looks at power in three phases: the sovereign power, the disciplinary power, and the biopower. Do you think with this logic of resilience that we've moved into a post-biopower world or regime?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think without wanting to go into a debate about how one interprets Michel Foucault, I think Foucault never suggested that there was a kind of succession of these three modes of power, from sovereignty to discipline to biopower. I think that's a bit of a misreading of his work. It's clear that that today we see the sovereign state still there. You only have to. I mean, I was at a workshop in Canberra yesterday with much discussion of Edward Snowden's disclosures of the role of the National Security Agency. In a sense, the current perception of security anxiety, the current perception that we live in a world of major security threats, has led to a reactivation of the powers of the sovereign state. It's also true that we still see major disciplinary forms of organisation, especially those for retraining the excluded subjects, and we do see an array of biopolitical strategies. If I think there is a way of connecting this up to biopower and biopolitics, and I wouldn't be too hasty in doing that for fear that one might replicate the kinds of blanket descriptions posing as interpretations that you see with neoliberalism. If I was to link it to that, I would say, well, with the work of Hollings in particular, with the idea that natural systems are resilient, with the argument that individuals are naturally resilient, that the vital properties of the human, in a sense, provide the pre-given basis for resilient strategies, that's an intriguing development. Going back to the previous question about the social, those of us, you're all too young, but those of us who remember the criticisms of Margaret Thatcher in the UK about the social state, Thatcher argued that the social was an artificial invention, that people did not have natural allegiances to this social state. They weren't social citizens. Where they did have their natural allegiances was to their kin and their community and those who they felt morally bound to. And this idea that community was in a sense natural and moral provided a kind of basis, a strong basis for those critiques of the social state. And in the same way, the suggestion that resilience is kind of natural in the human is a naturally resilient creature, in the forms of political argument provides a kind of powerful basis for those kinds of arguments. These arguments all work in that kind of strange way. Something is natural, but it can be produced. Community is natural, but we need to enhance community. Resilience is natural, but we need to enhance resilience. So you see that natural and production constructed again and again and again in the way in which these forms of rationality are argued. And so perhaps there, and I hadn't thought about it, so thanks for the suggestion, perhaps there is a way of connecting these up to more general shifts in forms of biopolitics. Are people here?
Hear me, so perhaps we'll go to someone in the audience first and I'll fix my microphone. Anyone else in the auditorium?
Shall I ask a question? Yeah. Hi. Thanks for your paper. I was just going to, in one of you said at one stage, if vulnerability is the problem, then resilience is the answer. This is what's being propounded. I wonder what your response would be to, say, someone like Judith Butler's work, who says that if vulnerability is the problem, then vulnerability is the answer. Because vulnerability and a shared sense of our collective and individual vulnerability and an acknowledgement of that is likely to lead to a political ethic which is more useful in today's age of climate change, for example, and war. And I wonder, in line with that, whether resilience, I know you did make this point about the sort of damning verdicts of neoliberalism, but if you look at the way in which resilience is used in, for example, Aboriginal Australia or in the developing world, then I wonder whether the concept of resilience, even though it has got something to say for it, has become so politically contaminated that we should look to something like vulnerability rather than covering vulnerability over with resilience.
I suppose I have two responses to that very interesting question. I don't think, just to go back to the Children of the Cow Eye for a moment, the title of that book, Vulnerable but Invincible. It doesn't suggest that resilience eliminates vulnerability. It means that in conditions of vulnerability, the most appropriate ethical and subjective form of engaging with that vulnerability is to enhance a kind of resilience. Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger kind of argument. So I don't think there's the kind of clear contradiction that you're suggesting there. Now, the question about whether the language of vulnerability has become so toxic, so contaminated by its distortions, that it's unusable, I guess that's a point for argument. I very strongly take the view that the most effective way of thinking about how one can test some of these strategies is to identify their points of weakness and turn them against themselves. Identify their points of weakness, find out other ways in which they can be articulated, turn resilience against resilience. Now, perhaps I'm wrong about that. But I don't find in the literature on resilience, I don't find the absence of resources. I do find many, many resources that are there. And I also would argue that political strategies that sought to reconstruct an all-knowing and all-powerful protective state in the face of some of these exigencies which we face, in the face of this perception of our present as beyond our capacities to calculate, where the future is not going to be like the present, and therefore it is not so easy to bring the future into the present and make it calculable, that if we need to think about other strategies, and I think we do, then just perhaps there are some resources in resilience thinking. I'm not going to go to the state for resilience. I think there are kind of two aspects to the argument that I've been making. One is a purely descriptive one, and maybe I should have just, it would have made me less vulnerable had I just left it at the purely descriptive one. Look, something interesting is happening. But one is also a kind of normative one, that perhaps one shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Okay, can I ask?
Did you get your question?
Please? Yes. So Anath has asked, do we need to re-socialise our structures to foster resilience? Are there any risks you can foresee in that kind of re-socialisation of structures?
I mean, these are rather normative questions, which I suppose I've opened myself up to, so I kind of can't complain. There are many traditions in the history of progressive, left-wing or socialist thought, whatever you might think about it, that do not identify sociality and the socializing of our structures with the organization of these things through a national state. My dear late friend Paul Hirst did quite sterling work in recovering the principles of associational socialism that one saw in Europe in the early 20th century, that in some ways sought to bring a kind of socialist way of thinking to ideas about communitarianism. So I do think one can recover certain modes of sociality and seek to enhance certain modes of sociality without thinking that they all need to or should do or should be understood in terms of the logic of recreating a social state. They don't all have to go through a national state. Indeed, they never ever always did go through a national state. And that's why I think that in some of these arguments about the, in a sense, the social embeddedness of the forms of personhood that resilience speaks of, there are already some resources for a new form of, a new way of socializing, to use that term, a new way of seeing how individual resilience grows out of collective engagement.
Are you happy to take one more from the Twitter sphere? Okay. So Michelle asks, can you be more specific regarding the aspects of the resilience discourse that you view as worth embracing and working for?
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. Sorry, I have to get used to these new technical forms. I've tried to do that, actually, by saying that many of the criticisms which do point to the absence of attention to those social resources out of which resilience grows, many of those are quite apposite, I think. So I do think one can go back to the resilience literature and one can see that in all the studies, and it depends what you think about these studies, one can describe them, but one can also draw upon them. But in all the studies of resilience as a form of personhood, it's a form of distributed personhood. It grows out of a set of distributed relations, complex distributed ethical relations. And those, I think, are worth trying to articulate in more detail, trying in some way or other to clarify, and trying to see how one can set those kinds of arguments against arguments that just say, oh, it's all a lack of resilience of whinging welfare dependence.
I have a microphone. Thank you so much, Professor Rose, and you've given me a lot of ideas to think about, in the following hours and days. But there's something I've been thinking about listening to the question and answers, and I've been trying to apply what you're saying to an area of progressive political activity here in Australia, which is around asylum seekers. And 2 days ago, in fact, Maurice Blackburn, which was a large legal firm, launched a case in the Victorian Supreme Court on behalf, it's a class action on behalf of people who are being held on Christmas Island and Manus Island. It's a claim for damages. And the lead applicant in that case is a 6-year-old girl who is suffering, her mental and physical health has suffered severely as a consequence of her detention and her family's detention for over 3 years. And I was linking that into your idea about the resources and the kind of resources that are required for resilience, and trying to connect that field of political activity and the notion of resources for resilience. And so I'm wondering if resilience is available for some and not for others.
It's difficult for me to comment on the details of this case, but one might say that there are certain practices, and perhaps the practices of incarcerating asylum seekers on distant islands, etc., systematically strip those individuals of the resources for resilience, actually make it impossible for them to form those collective bonds that would enable them to bounce back stronger. If that would be a way of thinking, then perhaps that would be a way of trying to understand a little bit more how one might engage productively in those areas. Of course, there are many dangers in resilience thinking. When you were speaking, I was thinking of Malala Yousafzai. I don't know if she's such a potent individual here. I mean, an absolutely admirable human being. Talk about bouncing back after a blow, etc. And then, of course, we can't all be Malalas. We can't expect every asylum seeker to be a Malala. So if you have the heroes or heroines of resilience, it also has some downsides, in that one can rapidly think, why is one not so resilient? Why aren't you so resilient? Why can't you be like X or Y or Z? So resilience can be highly normative, but it's not alone in that. Again, I work a lot in psychiatry and mental health, where there's a big growth of a movement for recovery. Recovery begins as a radical critique of certain ways of organizing psychiatric services, Pretty soon there are recovery houses where social workers and psychiatric assistants demand of their clients that they recover. Don't ask me to help you with this. Recover yourself, recover your independence. So if there's one message, one overriding message that I would just want to stress, certainly my way of thinking about these things, and it links to something that Jens said right at the very beginning. These issues are ethically complicated. To think that they're simple is to ignore the problem of analysis and to ignore the difficult problem of making those ethical choices. And all I guess I've tried to do here in a very preliminary way is to just begin to draw out some of those ethical ambiguities in these hybrid forms, and maybe think that we need to do some more work on the forms of ethical evaluation of these kinds of new strategies for governing.
That's a good place to conclude the event.